comfortable with being uncomfortable. And this sense of discomfort has really come from, as we've been able to see for many sessions, from questioning these false binaries that many of us in the development sector still use to understand the world. North versus south, haves versus have-nots, planet versus people, market versus state. So at today's session, we will really debunk one of those dichotomies at the center of how we conceive of the role of the state in our lives, and one that has been dominant for the better part of this century, and that kind of looks at government as either big or small. Colleagues, if you don't mind muting as you come in, I would appreciate it. I can't, I'm gonna have a hard time multitasking, muting and talking. Sorry about that. So today we have three guests. We have Angela Lusigi, the resident representative of Ghana UNDP Country Office. We have Stefan Klingbeil, the head of our UNDP Seoul Policy Center. And we have Jaideep Prabhu, a professor at the Cambridge University. Colleagues, thank you so much for taking the time and joining this conversation. We will start with Professor Prabhu, who has gotten quite a bit of following in the innovation community with his book in 2012, I believe, on Jugaad innovation, Jugaad meaning frugal in Indian, that explored this counterweight model to Silicon Valley of innovation by studying companies in emerging markets that were doing more with less, improvising quickly, and that showed a very different frame of what we mean and how we go about doing innovation. He followed that up by exploring the emerging frugal economy that was growing on the back of democratizing access to innovation, largely driven by technology, where millions of ordinary people can be plugged into sharing economy and generate services and products that have since become really ubiquitous in our lives, things like WhatsApp and PayPal and Airbnb. The question of what all of that means for public sector at large, how do these new technologies and different ways of organizing kind of affect the scale and scope of public sector and its relationship with the society at large, has drove him to his third book, and the reason we roped him into this conversation. There it is. There's the book. And again, it's a plug for the book, but it's a fantastic. I'm not through the whole book yet, but it is a fantastic read, especially for all of us working in development, because it provides, as you'll see, quite a bit of different frame to understanding the work in development. So, off the back of studying innovation in public sectors of China, Kenya, India, Bangladesh, Professor Prabhu kind of debunks this big versus small categorization of what government should be to consider a lot more nuances, where the government can at the same time help maintain collective public health in times of COVID, and at the same time ensure that the economy doesn't come to a halt. So we will start this conversation with Professor Prabhu talking to us a little bit about the insights that have emerged out of his research and the emerging levers of state power in 21st century. And we will follow this with Angela and Stefan's reflections, primarily on how some of these insights play out in their very different contexts and their day-to-day work with government partners. So you guys are here really as a kind of a reality check from your very different perspectives. And then we'll open up for Q&A. So with that, and without any further ado, Professor Prabhu, thank you again for taking the time, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Milica. That was a wonderful introduction. Really, you told the whole story there about the book and my prior work. So thank you for that introduction. And hello, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be with you today. So as Milica said, I'm here to talk about my new book. I have a presentation. So I'm going to share with you my screen. I'm going to speak for maybe 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll hear from Angela and Stefan. And of course, I'm very keen to hear your thoughts and questions. So please do ask your questions in chat, and I'm sure come to them soon. So, this is the title of the book, How Should a Government Be the New Levers of State Power? And how did I come to write a book about the government as somebody in a business school. So I've spent my career in the business school. And as Milica said, I've been looking at innovation in the private sector. That's been my area of interest. And particularly this notion of frugal innovation in the private sector. And over the last 10 years or so, I've been studying this phenomenon, which we see around the world really, of small teams that sometimes of our students in places like Cambridge, where I teach, who can now do things that only large companies or big government labs could have done 10 or 20 years ago. We see these teams develop highly affordable solutions faster, better, and cheaper across sectors, from financial services to healthcare, education, energy, and so on. And often these solutions seem to address social problems that we might typically think of as being part of the public sector or the state. So they have implications for the public sector and the state. So we see this kind of frugal innovation in various spheres. We see it in software. Milica was talking about WhatsApp. So WhatsApp famously was developed in less than 12 months by 4 young people with about 250K seed funding. And very quickly, it was delivering value to hundreds of millions of people. Huge numbers of people were using it, found it very helpful, useful. And of course, it also generated a lot of value for the owners who sold it to Facebook for close to $20 billion. So, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. We see this in software. We see this in hardware. This is a former student of ours, a mature student here in Cambridge. He was doing a part-time MBA while he was in the computer science department in the university, responsible for student admissions. And he and his colleagues had noticed that fewer young people were applying to study computer science. And even the ones who did had never tinkered with the hardware of a computer. They had never opened it up and so on and played with it, and they'd never done any coding. And so they had this idea of coming up with a really basic computer, a microprocessor that he's holding in his hand. And they said, this would be so basic, they would have to tinker with it and they'd have to code for it. And it'd be so cheap that if they broke it, it wouldn't be a big deal. And the first one was like about $30. They now have a $5 version. And they thought they'd sell a few thousand units. They've sold several million, not only to kids, but also to their parents, to their dads, who are using these to make all kinds of other frugal devices, Internet of Things devices. So you see this in hardware. You see this in emerging markets. This is an example from Kenya, where Vodafone introduced this service M-Pesa in 2007 to enable someone from a village, this lady from a village in Kenya, to use her basic phone, not only to call her son who'd be working in Nairobi and earning an income, but also to ask him to send money home in an emergency, which he could do just by texting her e-float that she could receive onto her phone and then cash in the local corner shop. And this was financial inclusion frugally, taking advantage of what was already there. People already have mobile phones, they're already used to texting, and they have corner shops in their village that can act as the paying agent. So you see this in emerging markets, but you also see this in the developed world. This is a spin-out company from the University of California, Berkeley, called CellScope. And they are leveraging the computing power and connectivity of mobile phones to come up with a whole suite of medical devices, like this otoscope that you see here, that just plugs into the audio jack of the phone and enables a mother to take very high resolution pictures of the inner ear of her daughter and send those images to a consultant who's somewhere else. This otoscope is a fraction of the cost of the standalone device. And of course, it enables telemedicine. And they have designed and developed several of these types of devices, including dermoscopes and so on. So you really see this phenomenon around the world in various sectors. And as Milica was saying, my co-authors and I first wrote a book in 2012 about this phenomenon in emerging economies like India and China, some African economies, Latin American economies. And then because we realized there was interest in this in the West for the West, we followed up with a book in 2015 about this phenomenon of frugal innovation in the West for the West. So, I wrote these 2 books and would talk about them to, groups from all over, at various points. And whenever I spoke about these books, invariably somebody in the audience would ask me the following question. They would say, so what does this mean for governments? And that question sort of just got, somehow embedded in my mind and kept coming back to haunt me. And I kept thinking about it, and I realized, well, actually, there are two sets of implications for governments of this kind of these kinds of opportunities. One, governments could be adopting this approach for their own operations and for their own services that they deliver to their citizens. So governments can, like companies, learn how to use new technologies and ways of organizing to do things faster, better, cheaper. But there's another aspect that's probably equally as important, which is what is the state's role in the economy and society vis-a-vis these new opportunities, this kind of frugal innovation? How can the state, or how should the state, regulate and cultivate this kind of frugal innovation in the economy? So I started to think about this, and eventually after 5 years, that's what came out of this process. And when I started to look at this question of how should a government be, I of course realized very soon there is a long debate on this question, going back at least 100 years. And there are, let's say, two polar views on this. At one end, you have libertarians who are skeptical of government. They believe that governments are inefficient and ineffective at best, and at worst can be dangerous, because if they get too much power, they then have the opportunity to misuse it. On the other hand, you have statists who are much more sanguine about the role of governments. They feel that governments may be the only force that can redress the vagaries and injustices of nature or the market. And like all polar views, there's an element of truth to them. Yes, governments can be inefficient and ineffective, but equally, governments have a very important role, particularly if you think about a crisis like now. And so if they have that role, then shouldn't they be trying to be as efficient and effective as possible? But equally, if they have too much power, will they misuse it? So that's the sort of space in which I try to work, a kind of vast middle ground between these polar opposites. And I asked the question, can governments be efficient and effective without trampling on our freedoms? And if so, how would that look? And can we have that both in times of stability as well as in times of crises, like during pandemics or financial crises? And my whole approach in the book is to explore this question, not theoretically through logic or abstract thinking, but really through practical examples, to actually go around the world to look at examples of governments doing this kind of thing, and then exploring the implications. So I start with a country I know fairly well, India, and a project that has in many ways transformed the public sector and even the private sector in many ways, particularly in financial services over the last decade. And this is the unique ID project, Aadhaar, which was initiated and led by someone from the private sector, Nandan Nilekani, who was the CEO and founder of India's largest software company, who also thinks a lot about some of the structural issues facing India and development issues. And he was invited in 2009 by the then Prime Minister to set up this initiative within the government. He organized it very interestingly. The techie people were in Bangalore, which is the sort of tech hub. And of course, the civil servants were in Delhi, which is the administrative capital. And these two groups worked very quickly to set up the framework and then roll out this project, where every Indian would get a unique 12-digit ID that was linked to their biometrics, their fingerprints and the iris scans. That would then be the basis for various government programs. And in less than 5 years, at less than $1 per ID, they were able to issue about 1 billion of this, more than 1 billion, because practically every Indian now has one of these. And in the very first year that they started to link the public distribution system and public benefits to the unique ID, they were able to make savings that outweighed the costs of the program in just 1 year, because they were able to eliminate fraud in the system. They were able to ensure that people who should be getting the benefits could identify themselves uniquely and get the benefits, and those who shouldn't, who were drawing down benefits fraudulently, would be eliminated from the system. Now, that project, I would argue, has been largely efficient and effective. So it shows that governments, even in countries like India, can be efficient and effective in delivering these programs using new technologies. However, there have been various issues to do with, for instance, the privacy of the data, the security of the data, what you are, what you are able to do, what your rights are, and what your responsibilities are vis-a-vis this ID. And many of those issues have been debated in civil society, in the press, and eventually the judiciary had to step in. So we see how one might be able to then balance some of these challenges when you have these big projects in the public space. I then turn to another very big emerging country, China, and I look at a big project over there, the social credit system, a national program that tracks the economic and social reputation of citizens and businesses. The idea is to give every Chinese citizen and business a credit rating based on their economic and social behavior. On the economic side, you have Western style credit scores depending on how you have honored your loans and things like that, repaid your loans. But they also have potentially intrusive measures of private and public social behavior, like for instance, eating in the public transport system. And then the idea is that your credit score can actually have real consequences in terms of your access to, say loans, but also things like the education system and mobility. So you can see how there's something very transformative here with the potential to do good, but also the potential then for the state to have enormous power over its citizens. Interestingly, so far, Chinese citizens seem to believe in the benevolence of the system. They think that it's largely meant to do good. About 80% of those surveyed had said that they had actually joined a social credit system, a commercial one, but many were not aware that it was linked to a government system. But of course, the upshot is that most seem to approve of it at the moment, thinking that it'll actually police bad behavior and reward good behavior. But we can see how something like this could easily be then misused. If, for instance, linked to things like facial recognition and so on, it could become part of a massive state surveillance system. So, where does this leave us? Clearly, governments around the world, even in the developing world, even in very large, complex countries like India and China, are clearly capable of being efficient and effective. We can see from these two examples that they're able to use new technologies and forms of organizing to do more and better with less. And of course, if they don't do it, someone else will. So for instance, the argument in India was if the government doesn't provide people a unique ID, then others will, like mobile phone companies will, or Facebook will. And then of course, they will have all that immense power and all that data. So perhaps it's better to have this in the public sector. But if the government then has all that power, then isn't the possibility of the government misusing the power, and who will control the government? So that's really the kind of space in which I'm trying to operate in the book. And actually, in some ways, the situation we face today is not that different from the situation in the 1930s, when the world was recovering from the Big Depression, the Great Depression, and we had competing systems around the world. We had the Soviet system, we had Nazi Germany, and we had the New Deal in the US. And at that time, Keynes, who was thinking very hard about these questions, said that the authoritarian state systems of today seem to solve the problem, these big economic problems like unemployment, at the expense of efficiency and freedom. But it may be possible by a right analysis of the problem to cure the disease whilst preserving efficiency and freedom. And it's really that balance between effectiveness, efficiency, and freedom that I'm trying to see if governments can achieve in this book. And my recipe is as follows. I say, yes, they can. We'll see examples of them doing it. They can use new technologies and forms of organization to do all this. But in order to balance effectiveness, efficiency, and freedom, they have to employ 5 principles when doing all this. And these are the principles. First, they have to be responsive to citizens. They have to place citizens at the heart of whatever they do and work outside in rather than inside out from the perspective of the bureaucracy. Second, they have to be inclusive. They have to balance the interests and needs of multiple parts of society, sometimes conflicting parts of society. Third, they have to be experimental. They have to be constantly willing to try out new ideas and learn from them. Fourth, they have to be entrepreneurial. They have to be proactive, often engaging early with new technologies and new players. And finally, perhaps most importantly, they have to be innovative themselves, constantly thinking about how they can create a culture of innovation within the public sector. So those are the principles for governments. But I conclude the book with a chapter on the role of citizens, because I think there is an interesting interplay between governments and citizens have a very important role to play as well. So I'll just briefly, before I end, go over some of these principles. The responsive state is, as I said, one that is citizen-centric. It works outside in from the citizen's perspective rather than inside out to design and deliver solutions. Often it will involve citizens themselves in the design and delivery of the solutions. And in this chapter, I look at particularly public services like social care. And I look at countries like the Netherlands, for instance, where very interesting models of social care have been introduced using very light touch technology and organization, where they take the frontline workers like nurses and really empower them to self-organize to meet the needs of their community. I then turn to how the state can be inclusive, balancing the needs of different groups of citizens, often when these interests are competing. I look at the case of Denmark, where for many decades, they have used this principle of flexicurity to balance the interests of employers, giving them flexibility to hire and fire, while protecting the interests of job seekers, ensuring that they have training and employment. I also look at how new ideas like universal basic income are being tried out around the world. And of course, in theory, there are pros and cons of something like the UBI. There are reasons why it would work. There are reasons why it may not work. So it's very important to actually see what actually happens in practice when we try it out. And that's why it's important, I argue, for the state to be experimental. The state and the public sector should constantly be trying out new solutions in pilots to reduce the risk of failure, evaluating them, and then when they've learned, scaling these solutions. In this chapter, I look at the UK's behavioral insights team, how that team has been doing precisely this in various parts of the UK government, and these ideas are now spreading worldwide. I also look at the What Works initiative in the UK, where the idea is in certain areas like education or criminal justice to constantly summarize the evidence on what works from around the world, and then disseminate it in a way that's easy for people in the field to actually use it on an ongoing basis. So for instance, in education, to summarize what's the evidence in a very simple way for head teachers and teachers within schools to apply this kind of evidence in their school. So those three principles are very much about the government doing its own work. Then I turn to how the government should manage the economy. And first, how it should regulate the economy, particularly this frugal economy. And here I argue the state has to be entrepreneurial in the following sense. It has to be proactive and engage early with these new technologies and these new players. And I give an example from Kenya of how I told you about M-Pesa, and I told you about how Vodafone introduced it, but it would not have been possible without the role of the central bank. The regulators played a very important proactive role, engaging early with Vodafone, identifying the key issues that they were concerned about to protect the consumer, like the robustness of the platform, whether it complied with international money laundering and so on. And then when they had got independent consultants and their own lawyers feedback, very quickly in about 6 or 7 months, they did the due diligence and then they gave Vodafone the go-ahead. But Vodafone had to also report constantly on how this service was working. And so that's how they regulated it. I also look in this chapter at autonomous vehicles in different US states and in the UK, how these states and the UK have created a regulatory framework, an open, light regulatory framework to enable different players to test and learn and share their learning with the regulator, so the regulator then knows what the issues are when they proceed with setting the agenda. Cultivating the economy. This is what we would call industrial strategy in the 21st century. Again, I look at autonomous vehicles and see how in the UK, for instance, the government has created small pots of money and certain challenges for different players in the economy to come together to try out these new technologies and ensure that the ecosystem flourishes. So, for instance, we see consortia coming together to get this money to test out new things. You have large and small car companies coming together with insurance companies, with software companies, and even universities, a bit like we've seen during the COVID crisis in the race to a vaccine. I also look at the space race and how in China and the US and Europe and India, we see the state playing an important role in coordinating the activities of various players, including the state sector. And I argue that the ideal approach to industrial strategy is one where the state is not attempting to do all the heavy lifting itself, all the rowing itself, but rather is coordinating the activities of others to create a vibrant ecosystem. And the final principle of the state itself being innovative, of constantly thinking of how to renew itself and improve itself, how to create a culture of innovation within government. Here I look at this at various levels. I look at how in Boston, in the mayor's office, at the city level, they have created a unit, a kind of R&D unit, innovation unit that's a small light touch team that's specifically tasked with identifying new opportunities, testing them, and then rolling them out. In Canada, I look at how this culture of innovation can be created and some of the obstacles to it, both at the city, provincial, and federal level. And finally, Bangladesh, where I look at the UNDP-led Access to Innovation, now called Aspire to Innovate program, led by Anir Chaudhry and his team. Anir is with us today and will probably tell us more about, I'm hoping, this program. But these are four things that I stick in my mind about this very impressive program in Bangladesh, an attempt to create a culture of innovation within the entire bureaucracy. One was the early emphasis on quick wins to get people on side to see what they could do, just one thing to make a big change, often using digital. The second was this emphasis on training, particularly to get civil servants to see the bureaucracy and the government from the perspective of the citizen. So in, say, 5 days of training, and the second day, they would go out into the field and actually put themselves in the place of the citizen trying to access a government service in another department. Then in the third day, they would do it in their department. And from this, they would learn a lot about their own department and how it engages with the citizen. And then with that insight, they would look at ways in which they might simplify the process, make it easier for the citizen. And they had a metric, a framework to help them with that, which they call TCV. The time that it takes for the citizen to access that service, the cost, and the number of visits. So that's really about how the government should be. And as I said, the final chapter then looks at what's the role of citizens in holding their governments to account. So obviously, citizens have a very important role. They have to be engaged and informed about, who their leaders might be. They then have to think about how to choose the best leaders, the best teams, what should they look for in leaders and teams. But they can also not just do that during elections, but between elections, by being engaged with the government, either from outside, putting pressure on the government to do the things that it promised, but most, I think, effectively, by joining the government and working for the government like you do. So that's the book in a nutshell. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I look forward to Angela and Stefan's thoughts and your questions. Thank you.
Super. Jaideep, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. It's interesting to me when I hear authors talk about their books, there's always something new that flashes out in addition to what's in the book itself, which kind of points a little bit to what we spoke about at the beginning, how the book is a moment in time. And then as you move along, you're kind of catching up with the changes that are happening outside. So maybe what I would do now is turn over to Angela first to hear a little bit from your perspective, how some of the insights that Jaideep shared with us resonate in your context in Ghana. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Milka, and thank you so much, Professor Prabhu, for that very succinct summary of the book. But I think it's much more deeper than that. So mine is just to look at it in the context of the work that we do in UNDP Ghana. as well as some of the other countries. Because as you know, our focus is on helping countries to actually strategize and implement the strategies to accelerate sustainable development. So it's very much in that context that we're looking at this technology because it's key, I think, in how we can transform how economies work so that both people and the planet thrive for lasting prosperity. And also, as you said, how we can help communities to be able to recover and transform after shocks and crises. So technology for me is, I think, a critical enabler. And my comments will be really looking at digitalization. I mean, technology is so broad, but I would like to just focus on digitalization because I think it's a key accelerator for what's happening now in development. So just to look at the framing of your book, of course, you started with the positives of technology and looking at some of the negatives. And at least in the case of Ghana and many African countries, we can see them harnessing digital technology to improve the effectiveness of the delivery of services. So now, I mean, you can, it's more transparent, it's more accountable. You can renew your license, you can get a passport, you can, you can do so many things that you couldn't do before. But I just wanted to highlight the fact that technology is not a panacea. It's almost like a tool that works together with an already well-functioning system. So to the level and to the extent that governments can coordinate better and work across sectors more effectively, then they're able to more effectively harness this platform. And we can see digitalization has become one of a priority for the ministries. We've had, in Ghana, we now have a Minister for Communications and Digitalization, there's digital strategies and so on. So it's helping to really create that coordinated structure that will be able to speak to the effectiveness and the use of technology in that way. You also spoke about the negative aspects about, power and control over citizens and the power and control by the private sector. But I put it to you that this is a function of the capability of the state. So in areas where there's a high degree of coordination with the security apparatus right at the center, then there's a high potential that this could be misused. But the real key issue for us right now is we still have weak internal controls and even the relationship with the private sector in such a way that my concern now is more about data protection. With all the information that is being collected through the systems that we are using now in response to COVID and so forth, there's a lot of data that is being harvested. But if we don't have the knowledge and the systems to be able to take that into account, I'm not so much worried about the power and control over the citizens right now. I'm worried about the control over the data and information that could be misused by, outside influences. Another thing that you also mentioned was about the role of the state in supporting innovation. I must say this is an area that is still nascent. It's growing, and as we know more and as we learn more about the systems and the ecosystems about how to support innovation, that will come through. But I think for now, what a lot of governments, and in fact Ghana and some other governments are doing, is to get out of the way. How can you facilitate what the private sector wants to do in terms of the infrastructure, in the legislation and the taxation, in ways that can help them to thrive, even as you come up with the more comprehensive systems that you would need to put in place. So my take on whether the government should be big or small is that I would like a capable, and I think a lot of countries are looking at having a capable and strong institution that will be able to help level the playing field. Because now we're talking about equity and distribution and the use of technology. A lot of what we're talking about is still the use of technology, not so much in the development of technology, which I think is also another aspect which we need to make that distinction. As much as possible, we would like citizens to be able to use the technology and participate also in the development of the technology. So I would put it that we would like a strong and nimble government that would be able to create the enabling conditions where citizens can be able to have fair access to technology. Now, in the context of COVID-19, what has Ghana done in terms of technology, which can be, I think, a bit of a learning for the process? One of the things that they did very early on, in line with already their organization to advance the response, was that they use technology to fight misinformation and to distribute the information that is needed to foster behavior change. And I think this is a critical aspect of how technology can be used in this whole area of misinformation. I think they also have been able to deploy technology in terms of testing and contact tracing, which is very critical in informing a response. Now we're going through second and third waves, but I think countries that have been able to more effectively use technology in terms of contact tracing, and it's now also being used for the vaccine rollout. So I think that technology and digitalization has been very instrumental in how governments have been able to respond to COVID-19, but it's on the back of how governments are organized. Now, this also points to the second area that you spoke about the misuse of information. And I think that is a critical issue that, which is why I'm talking about a capable state, is that what is the role of digital governance? When we talk about governments, it's not one, monolithic entity. There's executive, there's a legislature, there's, security forces and so on. So I think the aspect around digital governance is very important. And as you mentioned, I think you mentioned also the role of parliament, the role of the judiciary, the role of media, to make sure that we can look at who controls the data that is collected and what is our role as citizens. I'm very happy that you mentioned the role of citizens because I think it's important. And in closing, there are just three things in line with the 5 areas that you mentioned that I think it's important to reflect on, and why we need a capable, strong state. One is we need to democratize capabilities across society in order to reduce the inequality in using technology and also to enhance their participation in the development of technology that fits their needs. So definitely, I think a key lever and role of the government should be democratizing these capabilities across the society. And I also think that in the relationship with the private sector, creating enabling conditions where we can open up the way technology is developed. You mentioned the example of M-Pesa. You mentioned a couple of examples across the continent, but I think we should be looking at more open source solutions, because if we really want to use technology to drive the development solutions that we need to be able to have an environment where it's created in a more collaborative way to improve access and impact. And then finally, I totally agree with you. We need a capable state that is constantly learning. And this is something that I think you picked up in your book, because they have to keep up with how fast technology is progressing. They have to keep up with how fast the private sector is moving. And in order to engage with them, then they need to also be quite nimble and agile. And most importantly, they need to create that enabling environment for development while also protecting the new rights that emerge. A picture that comes to mind is that if you have a capable government, it's the same as you're driving your car down the street at 100 miles an hour. You only use 2 levers, accelerate a bit, put a bit of the brakes. But then if you have a state that doesn't have that knowledge and the capability, they might apply the handbrake, right? The emergency brake, and that's catastrophic. And I see in areas where you don't have capable states, then that tends to be the outcome in response to technology. So thank you very much for the opportunity to respond.
Angela, thank you so much for that. Maybe Jaideep, a quick reflection before going to Stephen quickly.
Yeah, Melita, wow, Angela, those are such, insightful comments. So deep, really, for me to hear you say those things. So many comments. I was writing while you were speaking, and you said earlier you should write a book. I think you should absolutely write a book. You even have wonderful phrases to describe what you're saying, but it's the insights that are absolutely sparkling. And some of the points that I underlined, control over the data, that's the question, not so much as I had said, maybe misuse of power. It's really what happens to the data and how does one ensure that that data is safe and secure, things like that. Your point about, what we want is a capable state, that is the capacity of the state to do good to its citizens. It's fine to be able to respond to a crisis, and to use technology, but you've got to be prepared, right? And that capacity will help you. Your point about technology, yes, it's not a panacea. It's a tool and it has to be used. Yes, it can be used well, but if you don't have that capable state, then you cannot use it well. I loved your analogy of the brake, accelerator, handbrake. I think the part that probably resonates most with me is some of your comments about how to encourage the use and development of technology and innovation in our societies and economies. That's something that really makes me very excited. And your point about democratizing and ensuring that these initiatives are collaborative, open source, things like that. And in the book, I write quite a bit about the maker movement, because I think that kind of maker movement, which is a kind of grassroots approach to manufacturing and innovation, holds a lot of promise for our societies around the world. So those are just a few comments. I could probably have a much longer conversation at some point, but I'll stop there and have Stefan share his thoughts.
Super, thank you both. Stefan, over to you, because we also have a number of super interesting questions coming in for the three of you guys. But Stefan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much, Jaideep, for your presentation and this great book. Let me just share with you 6 or maybe 7 quick personal thoughts. My first one is, I really like the book and your presentation. Just to highlight some aspects, I think it's really good to reflect on fundamental questions like what is the scale and the scope for governments, what to do. I think this is a very basic question, but it needs to be responded in each generation, in each year, in each day, in a different way, because challenges are changing. I also agree with Angela about this chapter on citizens. That's great. I could go to details, but I really love the way how you conclude. Let me just one nice quote to repeat it here. You are using in your book, and what you are saying there is the most terrifying words in English language. Ronald Reagan once said, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. That was really something I was laughing about when I was reading your book. Let me turn to my second point, rather my reflections. I think it's good to see that you have so many experiences when it comes to the private sector, and that you now turn to the public sector, to the government. What I was asking myself, also based on what I saw here over the last almost 2 years in Korea, is this kind of binary system, private sector on the one hand versus government versus state, a bit too simplistic. And let me just give you some details why I'm thinking about the interface between private sector and state is something what is crucial. Looking at the COVID situation here in Korea for the last more than 12 months, I would say one advantage in Korea I see when it comes to the government or to the country is the ability to what I would call to orchestrate different actors. So you have government, but government is not just government, it's national government, local government. This kind of interface is something what is so crucial. And I know in a couple of countries where this is not working. We have legislation. They need to come in. They want to come in. They are sometimes now bypassed. We need to have agile administrations. If you want to have a mobile COVID testing center, where to get those public servants from? You need to have the evidence. Yeah? If you think that evidence-based decision-making is something what is crucial, you need to have a channel, an interface to science. Yeah? not just to listen to them, but to have this kind of ability to communicate with them. Then civil society organizations. I must say here, one aspect I'm surprised of is that, for example, privacy aspects are not really an issue when it comes to, to the COVID situation. Just the question how to use credit card information, how to use CCTV, how to use other information for tracing. This is even not a debate in many European countries, and here it's just accepted. So civil society has also a role, sometimes a supportive role, etc. One last aspect, the role of IT companies for the management of the crisis was and still is so crucial. So what I'm saying here, to have a capable state government is crucial, but what is much more complex is how to bring together all these different actors. And so I would call it interface management, ability to orchestrate this kind of perspective on a situation. Maybe COVID-19 is a bit different from other challenges, but I could also refer to a number of other topics where I see that this kind of orchestration ability is really crucial to find solutions. My third point is, I would really love to think more about this. We all remember from the beginning of the COVID crisis, those nice rankings about public health systems, and that some countries were really at the top. And at least at the beginning of this kind of crisis situation, we saw that those top ranking countries were not able to perform. So they had the capacity in technical terms, but in reality, it didn't turn out that this was really an advantage. So what I want to say here is many of our perceptions, many of our rankings are based on those things that we are saying, oh, how many ICU beds do they have and all these things. But at the end, this is not the only aspect which is important. So many other things like leadership, like an approach where you really listen to science is also something what comes in addition. So quite often we have a too technocratic approach when we are ranking or assessing the situation. My fourth point is, this is something what you're doing with your book, listening to different stories, what is working and sometimes what is not working, looking at different situations, different countries. And this is really something what is crucial. And to a large extent here, my center, what we are doing is this kind of knowledge sharing with other countries. And what I'm asking all the time myself is, I would say what we are doing is good, is positive, is contributing to many things. At the same time, we understand that knowledge sharing has a number of limitations. And let me give you one example beyond what I'm doing here at my center. But I would say East Asian countries, including, of course, Korea, are able to manage this pandemic much better than many other OECD countries, rich countries. And from my perspective, this has to do with, let's say, limited interest, really, for example, for European countries to look and to learn from East Asian countries. So this kind of knowledge transfer, to learn from peers. Who are my peers? Am I eager to look at East Asian experiences is something what is a limiting factor and what also needs to be counted. My fifth point, and that might be an incentive for governments, for countries to pay more attention to this situation. What I find quite interesting here in the case of the Republic of Korea, that of course public sector is typically something what you look at from a domestic perspective. Yeah, is my public sector efficient? Are they fast, etc. But what I see is a very strong link to an external dimension. So what I want to say here, I think that the reputation of Korea really improved further because of the ability to manage this situation. And for example, you see it when it comes to number of applications of foreign students, but there's also a very, let's say, hard economic core. So for example, Korea was able to improve its World Economic Ranking from number 12 to number 10 because of, the ability to limit the negative consequences of the crisis. And if you could demonstrate more examples, give more examples how this link is working, this might be probably an additional incentive for governments, for countries to pay attention to this. Let me just quickly, my sixth point, and I was thinking about this, and I even did one paper with another colleague on this, the role of trust in institutions, in public institutions, but also in other institutions. And I could give you a number of examples here from Korea, how different actors were playing a role, from the administration to religious groups for many different reasons, and how the level of trust was changing over the last 12 to 14 months. But my most important point here, this kind of trust of citizens in institutions, in public institutions, in private institutions. Do you rely, do you trust your health authorities? Do you trust science? This is something what is really important. So, I mean, this is not to contradict what you are saying, but it's a slightly different perspective. My last point, very quickly, and probably just also supporting what you have in mind. In a way, we typically assume that all governments have an interest in faster, better, cheaper services. But from an academic perspective, I would also say maybe this assumption is quite often wrong. So what can we do about those countries where we have evidence that this assumption is not something what is reality in countries? Can we still do something about the situation? I think that would be a nice additional question to you and challenge for your next upcoming book. So thank you, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Stefan, so much. I'm a little bit torn because we have 3 really incredible questions, 5 minutes to go. Jaideep to reflect on Stephen, as well as colleague Anir, who is leading on one of the UNDP cases that found itself in the book, which is just fantastic and rare. So I'm going to be a bit of a bad guy here and do 2 things. One, I would like to call on Anir to reflect a little bit from his perspective on how do some of the insights from Jaideep's book play out in his context. And Anir, if I could ask you to take maybe 2-3 minutes, and then we would close with you, Jaideep, kind of reflecting on Stephen and Anir. And what I promise to the audience, especially colleagues who have asked questions, is to share these with Angela, Stefan, and Jaideep, and hope that you guys might invest a few more minutes in addition to this webinar to write out your reflections so we can get back to the colleagues who have asked questions. Is that okay? Just with a thumbs up. Super. Okay, Anir, over to you, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Millie. Jaideep, really good to see you, and excellent presentation as always. I was just thinking about the 5-step framework that you have and reflecting A2I or putting A2I into that framework. So when A2I was launched about 14 years ago at the Prime Minister's Office by UNDP, we realized that government had scale built into it, but no innovation, let alone frugal innovation. Any innovation would be big bang, expensive. So frugal innovation concept was not there. So basically thought that if UNDP could bring the frugal innovation concept and ensure the scaling up of it, then that's a winning combination. And that's how A2I was born. And it's been going on for the last 14 years or so now. And it's now being considered as a separate institution. So we're developing a legal framework as a body, new statutory body for A2I. We got momentum when the government, Honorable Prime Minister, announced the Digital Bangladesh Agenda is 2008, and that really gave us a lot of momentum, but not to say that A2I became a technology program. It actually remains a civil service reform program. So on the five things that you talked about, the responsiveness, you talked about TCV. So that's how we measure responsiveness of our service delivery within the government. The second thing is inclusivity. So empathy training, you mentioned, service process simplification.
1 minute, Anir. I'm really sorry. 1 more minute.
That's okay. So that really gave us inclusivity. Experimental nature, quick wins, innovation fund. We funded about 250 innovation projects. Empathy training launched about 2,000 innovation experiments. And the Prime Minister and Cabinet Secretary keep saying that failure is okay. So that really got the experimental nature within the government. Entrepreneurship, we have started the concept of a govpreneur, a government officer who's an entrepreneur, and we have redefined profit for that entrepreneur. So TCV is the profit. So reducing TCV is seen as profit. And the last part is innovative, so which really requires teamwork and incentives. So we have formed innovation teams in every department of the government, about 400 or so, and every district and sub-districts, another 600 or so. So that has really given us that teamwork, and incentives come from recognition and reward. So the last thing that I would like to add in 10 seconds, Millie, is beyond these five things, is a concept of policy Legos. So we have seen a combination of national ID, payment systems, data, and the service delivery framework that we have. These four things coming together for us to build new responses. So COVID was a good example. We were able to come up with a virtual court system within 12 days to reduce overcrowding in prison by 12%. So those are the kinds of things that can be seen as building together using existing assets. Thank you, Millie.
Thank you, Anir, so much. And really, please accept my apologies. This does not feel good because I too would like to hear more about it, but I'm conscious of colleagues filing out to other meetings. Thank you. Jaideep, maybe over to you as a reflection on Stephen's work and insights, as well as Anir and Angela, and kind of wrap us up.
Yeah, thanks, Millie. And thanks, Anir and Stefan. And Stefan, again, brilliant insights. I filled the whole page just writing down and underlining stuff. I'll just highlight a few things that stuck in my mind. Orchestration. I love that word. I use this term steering, not rowing, but I think orchestration, you put your finger on it, a capable state that can orchestrate all these other players, that understands what they can do well and bring them together in situations like crises, of course. Knowledge sharing and learning from peers. I love that. That was my intention in a way, was to look at countries around the world and see what we could all learn from each other. Bangladesh for me was a revelation when I first went there, to see, similar country to India, similar problems, and how they've approached dealing with their problems. And I've learned so much from BRAC and from A2I and Anir. As an Indian looking at Bangladesh, we should have more of that. The West can learn from the East. The external dimension, I don't cover at all. I think that's so important, how national governments link with other governments through organizations like the UNDP. And of course, within levels of government. Trust, it's so important. I think competence, a capable state, is linked to trust. If your state is competent, then you tend to trust it. If it's not, you will not trust it. That's a foundation stone. So I know many more things that I could respond to, but let me just say to Anir, you brilliantly summarized the book. And what I realized is that A2I, in a sense, embodies all those principles. And you point out how responsive to citizens, putting citizens first, coming up with a metric to do that. Then you have inclusion, looking at all these different parts of society, bringing all, even remote citizens into the picture, experimental, trying out new things, innovative, entrepreneurial, you got it all. So thank you again for being here today and sharing that. And thank you everyone from the UNDP. This has been a fantastic, fascinating discussion. I really hope we can continue the conversation. Thank you so much, Millie, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Angela, Stefan, Jaideep, and Anir. Of course, thank you very much for your time and discussion. Colleagues, I think we've seen the thread kind of come through IID conversations, where when we, first of all, the need to reframe some of the ways in which we have been understanding the world, and two, to debunk some of these longstanding assumptions that are no longer a very useful way of understanding realities. And when we do that, we start seeing alternative development paths. So I will end here. Thank you very much. We have recorded the conversation, so it's available for everybody to revisit. I will share the questions with our panelists. Thank you very much, and go off well into your day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to see you. Bye, Angela, Stefan, Milica.
Bye. Thank you all.
Thank you for a great discussion.
Thank you.